Hello. Thank you for joining me. My name is Wayne Davis. I was born July 28, 1937, in Pasco, Washington, a small town on the banks of the Columbia River of about 3,800 people, and across the river, a town of Kennewick, about 1,900, and upstream a few miles, a town called Richland with fewer than 500 people. It's a small town, but it's a vibrant town. It's a railroad town. But little did I know or anyone else know that this place was soon to become the very epicenter of creativity, innovation, and scientific discovery. It's a place in time and a place in my time where I came late. It's an ancient place as I began to imagine. I became consciously aware of just the magnitude and the immensity and the inheritance of the place. And I'm part of a family who established its presence in 1858 when my father's mother's grandfather homesteaded a quarter of a section of land, about 160 acres, in the Touchy Valley near Prescott, Washington, and planted wheat. So at this time, we had been here for almost 100 years. This town, again, as I mentioned, was a railroad town, which was its main industry. I remember every morning at about 7 o'clock, the whistle at the roundhouse blew a blast to remind us it's time to get up and get moving. And then a little later, 7:15 and 7:30, it blasted again to tell us it was really time to get a move on. It begins here. I am the product of a time defined by a high school industrial arts class, an attack and a declaration, a newly discovered element, and the attempt at a new experiment. The attack and declaration is about December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and that changed everything. And then 4 days later, on December 11th, Germany declared war on the United States, and that changed everything everywhere. But for the Davis family, we were already involved in building a new house. I told you, an industrial arts class. My dad was in this class, and as part of their final assignment for the year, the students were asked to design their dream home that they would someday like to build for their family. It needed to have a plan view, an elevation view, all the mechanical and electrical drawings, and a materials list. My dad graduated in 1931. Here, 10 years later, this will become the source for the construction drawings of our new house at 907 Park Street. It was built by J.G. Ungret and son. That was Jack and his son Cliff built our house, and they would later build and occupy the house right next door to us. On the picture on the left is my brother Bob and myself on the groundbreaking day when the new lot was purchased, and we were making final preparation to build the house. And you can see what it looked like on the right. It's a 5-room, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 784 square foot full basement house. And of course, you can imagine every day we went to the job site after dinner or just before dinner to see the progress, and what a thrill that was for 2 young boys to watch the new house being built. But what was going on around us was almost phenomenal as I look back at time. The Army Reconstruction Depot, which was known to us later as Big Pasco, was being built. It started in the spring of 1942, and it opened August 15th, 1942. And between the buildings, it had about 1.7 million square feet of covered storage, a huge facility, as you can see on the left panel on your screen. It became one of the largest and busiest Army depots of World War II, more than 100 rail cars per day on average. It served really several purposes. Excuse me, several purposes. One was to supply the military bases in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, but also to provide for a storage and shipment to the Soviet Union. And we shipped so much there. At the peak of the war, we were servicing about 225 rail cars per day for this operation. And it included everything that you can imagine. Locomotives were shipped as railroad freight, broad gauge locomotives moving to Portland to be assembled and shipped to the Soviet Union. You can see it above in the insert, and then below on the insert, boxed diesel locomotives on flat cars heading for Portland to be assembled and then finally shipped. One of the things that I didn't realize until I was doing the research was that the tremendous amount of supplies that we sent to Russia. I mean, we were occupied with our own problems. We were mobilizing millions and millions of people, reconstructing, reformatting all of our output at that time, but we were, yes, occupied, but not preoccupied. Under the Lend-Lease agreement with Russia, the supplies that we sent included 400,000 Jeeps and trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 7,000 tanks, more than 11,000 aircraft, and 2 million tons of food. Also, the locomotives that on the picture, they received 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 rail cars. It said that the primary trucks and Jeeps for the Russian army were of Dodge 3/4 ton and Studebaker 2.5 ton models. A huge contribution to the war effort, and then our ally Russia. And then next, a few months later, what happened? A naval air station construction began early in 1942. And I was surprised to find out how quickly it went up. The naval air station went up in about 3 months from the time that they broke ground, bulldozing the sagebrush land next to town, and building the runways and buildings and so forth that accompanied it. It included about 70 buildings and a large contingent of waves doing the office work and the technical work. It was also a facility to handle Lend-Lease distribution as well. But we are to train 1,800 pilots with 300 aircraft. The total support staff made the base occupation about 7,500 people. Amazing. You can see in the pictures some of the hangars, some of the airplanes that they were the trainers. They had their own Navy band. They even had their own jazz band, dance band that played on Wednesday nights at the USO Club in Pasco. So it was a vibrant place with a lot of activity. Next, the Hanford Project, which was a completely new city. As I mentioned, it had fewer than 500 people. They demolished most all of the structures, saved a handful of them. It was to be a place where they could house 50,000 workers and their families. This is an amazing thing to me as I again looked into the research and found that they broke ground on March 22nd, 1943. Now imagine that, 1943, they broke ground. They brought in 44 locomotive engines and everything that goes with it, 2,000 trucks, 900 buses, 240 tractors with trailers, 460 rail cars, 5 locomotives, and 4 derricks as well. They built 368 miles of highway, 158 miles of track, poured 780,000 cubic yards of concrete, and moved 25 million cubic yards of earth. They brought in about 1,000 workers per week. At the peak, it was right at 1,500 through what they called recruiter trains. Now, these weren't dedicated trains to the recruitment. They included a car where they could put on about 15 people that they recruited at each of the stations, sometimes a few more than that, depending on the requests. And the requests came from the administrative office in Pasco, where the recruiters got their instructions on what was needed. They then gave them enough money to have food on the train to allow them to get to Pasco, where they could be unloaded and then bused to Richland or to Hanford at the time, and where they lived in tents and so forth. DuPont was the contractor originally. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, the president, insisted that DuPont take the job. And of course, DuPont pleaded their case and told the president, we are not physicists, we're chemists. We don't know anything about the project that you're doing. FDR insisted that they take it because they had the scale in which to manage a project of this size. The only caveat to it was that FDR insisted that this be a cost plus project, and the plus was $1 profit, and he wrote that into the contract. Interestingly enough, too, I found that the alphabet houses, and I had known about that and heard that people lived in a B house or an H house or some other type of house, but didn't realize that the architect that they hired was a Swedish architect from Spokane. They came to Pasco and they operated the top floor of the high school, where they designed the city from ground up. Now, imagine what ground up means. You know, we have to put in sewage systems, water systems, electrical grids. We had to put in hospitals and streets and highways and schools, pool halls, recreation centers, grocery stores, everything that you can imagine that you need for a city, they had to build. So they built the alphabet houses on site, but they also had some prefabs and pre-cuts that were fabricated by Hoffman Construction in Portland, Oregon, and others that were put on barges and sent upstream from Portland to the site and unloaded and put on then on the slabs that were prepared for them to be built on. To the left panel at the bottom, you can see what the trailer camp looked like, and this was before the houses were built. They brought in a number of trailers so men could finally bring their families with them to get settled in this new town. Started again in 1943 in March. The pay for workers at the time was the range was $1 to $1.85. The highly skilled workers like machinists and steam fitters and iron workers received the higher wage of $1.85, and others in between and so forth. And then came Camp Hanford. We had to protect the facility. We had 16 anti-aircraft artillery placed around the facility called Camp Hanford. It was a very meager living, if you will. This is what the site looked like, as you can see on the left panel of your screen. Very stark. Up about in the middle to the left, you can see a small structure, and then to the left of that, another small structure. They did have housing for them. The buildings consisted of, metal buildings, concrete block structures, and so forth. They were assigned to this battalion to rotate about every 2 to 3 months back to the Army barracks in North Richland, but 16 anti-aircraft artillery encampments for this. And then the Army B-17 airfield in Walla Walla had about 300 buildings, 8,000 servicemen, and 594 crews. And the crews for a B-17 at the time were that of 10 men. So it was a large facility. It grew to train more than just the B-17. The new B-24, which was being developed by the Boeing company, was also training there, and others as well. Well, I really found what was interesting about how fast we brought not only the facilities and the manpower up, but how we got the aircraft and all of the other things that we needed so quickly, because we had no facility to build them in 1941, even till mid-1942. And now by 1943, we have hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of aircraft. And I found that the Ford Motor Company in their Willow Run plant was building a B-24 model, and they were building one and produce one every single hour, 24 hours a day. And interestingly enough, they had a facility that had 1,300 cots in it, and these cots were for the crews that were waiting to get their airplane. As soon as it was ready, they would get in it, take off, go to the training field, finish their training, and then go into battle. Amazingly, Ford would build about 18,000 of these B-24s at their site in Willow Run. And this is what some of those look like. This is newspaper clippings from the Walla Walla paper showing some of the training and some of the bombers that were being used in that training. Also, a few miles away in Umatilla, there was a chemical depot of about 20,000 acres, 2,000 personnel, and 1,001 igloos. And what those igloos look like, as you can see here, are something like a Quonset hut, a semi-round that was buried in the ground almost to the top. And they started the facility in 1943 and finished it in 1944. It was a repository for rockets, bombs, and ammunition. There were more than 106,000 M55 rockets filled with sarin gas. That's the VX gas that kills by asphyxiation or paralysis on skin contact, and it was housed there. There was one accident. There's a picture of the accident in the middle of the page. A 500-pound bomb accidentally exploded, killing 5 men and 1 woman. And then Camp Columbia, just north of Richland, West Richland actually. Camp Columbia was for prisoners. It housed 1,300 prisoners, 40 guards, and they processed 5,600 tons of fruit during fruit harvest season. And those were from the trees that were confiscated by the government to accommodate the Hanford Project. About 650 square miles was confiscated. They were allowed to take what they could in 30 days. Other than that, the farmers and the people of the orchards had to leave the premises. So what they kept the trees alive and so forth with the guard prisoners, or the prisoners and the guards, and they harvested the fruit for the military and for the people of Richland. Also at the time, just as a note, to know how the tension really begins to pressure people. At this time, the Japanese were sending incendiary bombs via balloon. They sent 9,000 incendiary bombs via balloon to the west coast of the United States. They did some damage. There was at least one family, a mother and her 5 children in Oregon, who were killed by one. There were several that came down in eastern Washington around Spokane, Okanagan country in there, but they didn't really have any effect on the war. The Japanese were sure that they could light up the entire West Coast forest and then divert all of our attention and manpower to put it out, but it didn't work. So this is what the camp looked like, very bleak. It was used to house minimum custody type improvable male offenders. And those were people that were conscientious objectors, violators of rationing and price support laws, those convicted of espionage and sabotage and sedition, and those convicted by military courts-martials that had to serve no more than 1 year. And finally, Grand Coulee Dam. For thousands and thousands of years, the pyramids at Giza held the record as the largest man-made object in the world. Soon this record would be shattered by the construction of Grand Coulee Dam, a man-made structure that would be 3.5 times the size of Giza. And in my view, the most creative thing about this dam is that it too would be built of blocks. Yes, blocks, just like the pyramids. Blocks that were 50 feet by 50 feet by 5 feet and embedded with cooling tubes to manage the curing process. This is why I said this is a place at the outer edge of creativity and innovation. Huge. Thousands of years it had reigned, and now we had taken over. I have a picture of, in the insert, of Block 40J, which was the first block poured for the dam. It was completed in 1942, and thank goodness. As soon as it was completed, we needed it. We needed the electricity in Seattle, Portland, and farther south in California to build for the shipbuilding industry, for the airplane industry in Portland and Seattle as well, and also for the cold water and electricity that we would use at the Hanford project. Interesting. It was originally set to do both, electricity and irrigation, but they set the irrigation aside and said, we'll get back to that after the war, of which they did. And their goal was to irrigate 1 million acres. They have not met that goal yet, but they're very close to it. And over time, it has proved to be one of the best investments the government had ever made. And then on the left-hand panel, you can see the railroad. The railroad is interesting to me that because my dad worked there, I noticed on my birth certificate that my dad's occupation was listed as a service station attendant. He pumped gas, he did change tires, he did all kinds of things. He tuned engines, changed oil, and did lubrication and so forth. He was a young kid out of high school. He had grown up on the Snake River where his dad had a ranch that raised horses, and he didn't want to be a part of that life. He wanted something different. So he came to Pasco to go to high school. When he finished, he got a job at the service station, and he worked part-time at the railroad as a yardman. He was a switchman. He helped build trains when they would come in, tear them apart, put them back together to go here, there, and everywhere. He loved the job. And of course, the war was really something that promoted him quickly. He got a full-time job. And because he got that full-time job, he could now build that house he always wanted to build for his family. And as a side note, my father would become yardmaster of the entire yards for the Northern Pacific Railroad in Pasco. This is what it looks like. It was a huge operation. It had an ice house to service the refrigerated cars of the massive amounts of produce and fruits and vegetables that came out of Washington State. Even at the time, Washington produced in the neighborhood of 60% of apples, pears, raspberries, peas, carrots, and so forth for the nation. So the ice house was to service the refrigerated cars. It had a roundhouse with 37 stalls to repair locomotives. It had a cleaning track that cleaned and serviced all cars except the tankers, gondolas, hoppers, and coal cars. I worked on the tracks during summers during high school. It's a brutal job, a totally brutal job, I can swear to, but so rewarding. And then finally, plutonium. Plutonium, to me, just blew me away because what happened, plutonium was the last element on the chart. There was nothing past that. The periodic tables only stopped at element 94, nothing past. It was brand new. We had never worked with it. It had only been discovered in December prior to December 1940. And it was amazing to me that we were going to have something in, excuse me, in Pasco and at the Hanford Project that we have never ever tested before in life, and it was a brand new thing on the table. Plutonium, uranium was discovered in 1789. That's element 92, and we had known about that forever and ever, but element 94 is brand new. There were 3 places that interacted with this Hanford plant. It was called the XYZ sites. The X site was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They were involved in the uranium 92, and they were responsible for the Hiroshima bomb. Y was the Los Alamos, New Mexico site where they designed and tested all the bombs, and the Z factor was Hanford, plutonium 94, and it was the weapon for Nagasaki and so forth. So you can see that it's a brand new 1940 in December of that year. It was discovered, and then they adopted by the project as an experiment. And as I was doing the research, I really found it interesting that some of the scientists were really very concerned with the idea that, uranium explodes. So it's like a big explosion. It just erupts in front of you. Plutonium implodes on itself and builds its force by continually imploding and imploding and imploding. And some of the scientists were somewhat concerned, can we actually stop that process? We have never done it before. We need to be sure that we can stop that process. So they were very aware of the fact that implosion brings on a whole different ballgame than explosion. So what does exponential change look like? Over the 3 years, 8 months, the U.S. produced 325,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 1,400 warships, 2.5 million trucks, 750,000 artillery, millions and millions of rifles, not to even mention the ammunition, the bombs, the gas, the food, the clothing, the supplies and facilities required to get us from here to there. Now, we got from here to there very quickly. Just as a side note, we were bombed in 1941 December, as I said, and you know that very well. By November of 1942, we sent 300 ships and 100,000 trained soldiers to fight in North Africa. And we got there on the shores of North Africa without ever being hit by a submarine torpedo or anything. We lost no ships, no manpower, no nothing. Britain sent down their cohort of ships and people as well. But in less than a year, we had 300 ships. Now, we didn't have any ships, understand. We weren't building ships for war. We had sent our last 50 ships to Britain under the Lend-Lease Act to help them out. So we didn't even have backup. We started from scratch, from dead scratch, 300 ships, 100,000 men fully trained, and we were at the shores of North Africa in November of 1942. Two kinds of ships that got my attention, of course, is the USS Pasco in 1943. It was launched in Richmond, California. It's a patrol frigate and commissioned and served in the wartime. She later served in the Soviet Navy and in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. The USS Pasco in 1943. On the right-hand side of the screen are the Liberty ships. And when we started going to war, FDR and the people that were managing this war said, we cannot provide space on these ships for material, because we have to send men on the ship. We need a separate ship to send our materials and to get out in front of these men or follow them very close behind. So they designed what they called a Liberty ship. Here's what's interesting about that. They wanted the Liberty ship to be funded by the people of the United States and not the government. So every organization had the right, if they wanted to sponsor the building of a Liberty ship. And the average cost at that time was just under $2 million. That would be about $33 million in today's money. We built 2,711 Liberty ships, sponsored by organizations all over the United States. We built them in 13 states by 15 companies, 18 shipyards. The average day of construction for a ship was 70 days. Isn't that interesting? They had several holds. I think they had 5 holds in them that would hold cargo and so forth. You could strap airplanes and other things to the top of them, tanks as well, and so forth. They were named after, you could name them and recommend who you wanted them named after, and you had to name them after somebody who was deceased. It was not somebody that was living. So they allowed you to suggest a name, which they adopted and painted on the side. There was one exception. They named it after a person that they assumed had died in the Second World War, but 2 years later, he showed up and he had been in prison camp in the Pacific and had been freed from that prison camp. They did not, of course, take the name of the ship away. It was still named after him. 2,711. Well, actually 2,710. One did burn in the shipyard, and they had to salvage it. Now, the reason they could build them so quickly, let me just point that out, is that they were prefabricated in different places in modules in 250-ton sections that could be placed together and assembled at the shipyard. So they didn't actually build them ground up, they assembled them. And each of the sections contained, on average, 250,000 different parts. A time of great sacrifice and determined tenacity, to say the least. But without thinking twice, everyone did their part. The scope to me is mind-boggling. The response is overwhelming. The planning is compelling. I think the execution is astonishing, and the result is life-changing. What went on in the small little place that I grew up in, that started out at 1,300 people, and soon would be well over 100,000 people. How did it affect life in the United States and in our part of the world? Rationing was used between January 42 and December 45, and most everything was rationed. Tires, automobiles, gas, bikes, fuel oil, kerosene, foods, meats, fats, everything. Shoes particularly, and even typewriters were rationed. So you could not buy much without a ration card. And I remember when Bill Moyer said after his parents died, he was going through the boxes in their house, and he came across their ration book, one of their ration books, and he opened it up, and he said he was taken aback by how many stamps had not been used. And I too, with my dad's, I have one of my dad's ration books, and he didn't use them all. He only used a few. And I too wondered why. Was it just laid on in the war? No, it wasn't. It was a mentality. So it's interesting to me that at that time, people did what they needed to do to help the cause. And how they managed this, they managed it through ration boards. There were 8,000 ration boards across the country that administered the program. And they looked something like this. These happen to be just images I picked up off of Google or somewhere to show what they look like. They're very plain. They're on somewhat brown paper. They're all made out by hand. They're not in typewriter. Some are punched, some are torn out, etc. What I did was amazed by that the original book 1 contained 28 war ration stamps. When you went to apply for this book, you had to swear at how much sugar you had at home in your cupboard, and you had to tell them what it was. And once you did that, they tore out those stamps because you already had some of that ration that you were entitled to. And I think the message is in the top left. If you don't need it, don't buy it. And people, in my view, honored that so much. Victory Gardens was a huge success. 20 million Americans raised garden vegetables and fruits as a Victory Garden. My dad was a consummate gardener and loved everything about them. And we had gardens and gardens and gardens. So about 15 million families planted Victory Gardens in 1944. And then it rose to about 20 million by 1945. How they planted them is you could buy the kits from Burpee's Seed or from Oscar Will Company Seed and so forth. And you can see the seed packs here in front of you. The Burpee seed packs contain 5 seed varieties. You can see it had tomatoes and radishes and carrots and beans and so forth. And that cost 45 cents for the 5-pack. The Will's Victory Garden collection, $1.60, had 16 seed packs, and everything on the shelf that you see there was in that seed pack. And many of the mothers and wives did a lot of canning. My mother canned all the time. We had canned vegetables and fruits and everything in between on our shelves in the basement for years and years and years from the garden. The draft. How did we get our people to join this thing? You know, I want you for the Army. The nearest recruiting station is where you need to go. The Selective Service Act of 1940, as we were anticipating the idea that we might have to enter the war, the act required all men between ages of 21 and 25 to register. And once the U.S. entered the war, it was extended. The task was made more complicated. For example, November 1940, a year after we got involved in the war, through August of 45, about 18 million men were examined for induction. 6.4 million were rejected, about 36%, because of vision, health, and disease. So it wasn't just an automatic thing. You have the manpower, they're all ready to go, you got them get them in place. More than a third of them could not qualify because of vision, teeth, or disease. Another thing that happened at the time was, where do you put all of these people? This town they built in Richland would not house the entire population of the workforce. It would only house about 1/3 of the population. The rest had to do for themselves in finding a place in Pasco or the city of Kennewick. The government came around to people that had a basement, and most everyone in our area had a basement, and they asked if they might build an apartment for people that could live there on a temporary basis while they were waiting permanent housing. My dad said, of course you can. Let's have at it. We have 700 square feet in the basement. All it has is a laundry tub and an open bathroom and shower and nothing else except the furnace. And they said, okay, we'll do that. They completely finished, painted, and furnished the apartment. It was a 1-bedroom, a large multi-purpose living room, and a small pantry kitchen. And my guess, about 320 to 400 square feet. And then they also then used the laundry facility in the basement and the bathroom and the shower as well. And then the open space, we had an open second bedroom for those that had the need for that. We had several families live there, a scientist I know, a wife and a junior high school son. We had a Navy sailor, his wife Elsie, and their 2 children, and the Air Force serviceman and his wife who had stationed at Walla Walla. So we had a number of people in our basement. And why it's so interesting is that because in that basement there was no 220 electricity, only 110. So they had a little stove on the top that they could put a maybe a pot of coffee or something to warm up. So they had to use the oven in our kitchen upstairs. So they would come up at night, day and night, and use our oven. And they would coordinate that with my mother, what times would be a good time to do it. So we always knew the people that were there. We knew what they were eating, and we knew how they got along and so forth. It was a great time. I loved every one of the families that was there. We got to know them so well. Elsie Christensen, I befriended her and kept in touch with her until she died in her 90s. I sent her flowers twice a year, once on her birthday and once at Christmas, and stayed in touch a lifetime. So this place that I call the epicenter of creativity, innovation, and scientific discovery is something that has stayed with me all of my life, wondering just how did we do that? How did we get from here to there? What was our contribution? Why was it so important? And I think we came through markedly well, spectacularly well, on getting the job done. A time it seems we are at the point in the course of human social evolution when our personal demands converge with the higher ideals of humankind and the well-being and flourishing of human society. I believe it's a time not about either or, but about both and. I believe it's a time not about win or lose, but about win for everyone. I believe it's a time not about concession, but about consensus. I believe it's a time not about confrontation, but about conciliation. And I hope for that to be in our future. Thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Stay well and be safe.